Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, Merrill's Curator of Collections. Last time we finished chatting with photographer and farmer Amy Bateman about her project and exhibition 40 Farms, which explores contemporary farming life across Cumbria and the Lake District.
This time, we're moving deeper into the past to talk about the history of the commons.
So in a really broad way, the commons is essentially the natural resources that we all share: air, land, water. But we're really speaking about something more specific this time round. We're talking about the legislation and rules that govern our access to these resources. So shaping who's allowed into space, what they're allowed to do there, and why.
We also talk about the process of enclosure in which that access was restricted over time and how that came about.
And bringing that story right up to date. So this is a really exciting contemporary story as well as an historical one.
Definitely. Our guest is the brilliant Professor Katrina Navickas, Professor of History at the University of Hertfordshire. Katrina researches the history of protest, public space and landscapes in England. We're chatting with Katrina ahead of the release of her next book, Contested Commons, A History of Protest and Public Space in England, which comes out later this year.
Enjoy.
All right, welcome to Absolute Units, Katrina Navickas. It's brilliant to have you with us.
I'm really excited for this. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Katrina, to kick us off, we've been looking at an advanced copy of your amazing new book, Contested Commons, which comes out later this year. Thank you very much for sharing that. It's been really exciting to have a look. We'll get to the idea of the contested commons in due course, but I wonder whether we could kick off by getting a sense of what the commons is, where that stems from, and whether it's still relevant today.
Sure. So I chose the commons as the main theme of the book because I think it's a really important concept that we still think about today. This idea of a place that's available to all, that's even belonging to all. Quite often that sometimes conflicts with the reality, historical reality of what common land is, what common rights are. And so it's really important to know about that longer history of where common land comes from and how it's been contested over time. But yeah, the commons is a slightly nebulous concept in that it emerges really with the long history of medieval England. I'm not a medievalist, I'm a modernist, so do go and speak to a medieval historian if you want to know more about the early period. But essentially, property rights start to formalise, I think, in the 13th century. So there's a Statute of Merton in 1235-36, which essentially defines the commons as it's owned by lords of the manor, but the tenants can have customary rights over that land to use it in various ways. That's the kind of legal definition under English common law of people using the commons, but it's not owned by people, it's owned by the lord of the manor.
And when you say tenants, by that, do you mean kind of like medieval serfs and peasants? Are they the kind of people who'd be tenants of common land?
Sure. By the middle of the medieval period, we're moving out of that feudal environment. So we are looking at tenants who are paying rent to the lord of the manor, a much more commercial system. And they have rights usually attached to their property. So if they live in a cottage that belongs to the lord of the manor, they might have the right to put their pigs out into the orchard to gather the apples or the acorns. They might have the right to put some geese on a common, and geese become quite an important feature of commons history in this period. They might have various rights to take fuel from the woods or from the peat marsh, things like that. These are called profits à prendre, which is kind of old French for stuff you can take from the environment. But essentially the lord of the manor owns everything, but customary rights develop over time, over centuries, that people can use to keep their livelihood going.
Yeah, so we just recorded a couple of amazing episodes and released those with Dolly Jurgensen talking about medieval pigs. And some of those common rights around pigs come up in those episodes. So it's worth checking out those if you want to know a little bit more about the medieval context, particularly around pigs. Very piggy episodes.
We love pigs.
We do.
We really do.
And we love them even more after talking to Dolly about them. I'm just going to pick up on something you said there. In that translation of the Old French, you're referring to sort of natural resources. So this is sort of air and water and land and plants and things like that. That in some sense, it feels a bit like we all have a shared common right to. But the contrast there through what you're saying is that actually none of these things belong to us. These things belong to the lords of the manor. So
Yeah.
That seems like a tension running through what the commons is. It's not quite as common and shared and, for all of us as it sounds.
Yeah. I think there's a myth of the commons. There's a myth about the land belonging to the people. There's a later myth around what happens to that land, but certainly the idea of the commons as shared resource for everyone isn't quite right in practice. Often it's quite highly regulated. It can be quite commercialised. You can buy and sell these rights to use the land. And quite often it's defined the types of people who can use it. So it might only be the tenants of the Lord of the Manor. It might only be particular people who live in particular cottages. So there's a kind of broader cultural conception of what the commons is, which is open for everyone. But there's actually, under English common law at least, there's more restrictive definition of who has those rights. And it's all based on a property system. It's increasingly based on a commercial system.
It does feel really significant because I think that myth is very widespread about what the commons is. I feel like until fairly recently, that was my conception of the commons, was that it was a space that anyone could use freely. And it was really only when I understood about commoners' rights and who commoners are that this kind of started to make more sense to me.
Yeah, and they're often quite specific rights. You've got the right to herd 5 geese on this piece of land and things like that. You can take a certain number of branches, but they've only got to be this diameter for fuel. So it gets really pedantic, and people do defend them and go to the manorial court to contest these different rights. So throughout history, from medieval times onwards, commons are contested because they're the spaces of resources. There's other ways in which people think of the commons which complicate things. There's also village greens, which are open to all, and that's where you do your leisure, your cricket match, or your dancing around the maypole, and that's much more about access and leisure and recreation rather than agricultural uses, which is what commons, and another term comes through, which is waste, which is the kind of uncultivated area of the commons. Often we use it to describe fells and moorland that can't be cultivated.
So over time, we're also talking about tracts of land that are becoming fewer and further between, aren't we? So through processes of enclosure, the commons and what's available to commoners has been chipped away at and cut away at and minimised to the bare bones. I wonder whether you give us a sense of some of the potted history of enclosures from the medieval right up to the 19th century and ongoing, and what the kind of implications of those enclosures were. What were the consequences of that kind of process of shutting down access to particular spaces for wider populations?
Sure, that's the other myth. So we had the myth of what the commons are. The other myth that comes through quite a lot throughout 18th, 19th, modern centuries is the myth of enclosure, that there was one big enclosure act that the government passed and that took away everyone's land. That took away the land from the people. Again, that's a myth. It's not true. Enclosure is a much more gradual process where lords of the manor decide that they want to develop their land for agricultural uses, for what's called improvement. It's a very kind of jargony term. It sort of feels like a modern term, but it's used in the 18th century in particular. And it means consolidating small pieces of land into large fields, using much more mechanised processes to farm the land, starting to think about using lime and other improvements of chemicals to enrich the fertility of the land. So it's the start of what used to be called the agricultural revolution, kind of industrialising farm production. And enclosure helps that process by creating much more regulated and much more regular pieces of land that you can farm.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And this sense that somehow enclosure is this monolithic one single force that takes away the commons in one fell swoop is also fascinating. I recently went to see 3 Acres and a Cow, which is an amazing performance, sort of folk song piece that tells some of the potted history of this. And they have what they describe as the washing line of history, and they hang these different moments on the washing line of history, and it's just one lengthy litany of chipping away in little small increments at some of these rights. And they start right as far back as the Peasants' Revolt, and right the way forward to much more recent experiences and sort of acts and changes to law. And your book takes us through a vast swathe of those kind of changes as well. And in particular, you're picking up on some of the 18th, 19th, 20th century shifts in legislation. I wonder whether we might start in the 18th, 19th century. And are there any key moments of enclosure, key events, key incidents that you think you would point to as the major shifts in that period?
Enclosure starts really in the 16th century under the Tudors, but the big wave of what we now see as the changes to our modern environment happen in the 18th and 19th century, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars. So I think the peak of enclosure happened between the 1790s to the 1820s. There's also a shift in the way in which enclosure happens. So previously, in the early period, it was much more about agreements between lords of the manor and the tenants and the farmers. But by the 19th century, it happens through parliamentary legislation. So in order to enclose a piece of land, you put forward a bill to Parliament. And there are thousands of these bills. And they go through Parliament saying, I want to enclose this particular hill. Here is the supporters of this measure. The Lord of the Manor is going to get 20% of it. The Vicar's going to get another 10%. This is how enclosure is operated in this period. It's called parliamentary enclosure because it goes through Parliament. So I think that's where the kind of myth of the government taking away the land from the people comes from. The government does eventually pass a General Enclosure Act in 1845, which tries to regulate this system so they don't have to do all these individual acts, but you still need an individual Lord of the Manor to put forward the bill. So it becomes a much more bureaucratic process. But essentially, I think the main change happens during the Napoleonic War because we've got food shortages, there's harvest failures, Napoleon's blockading the country, so you can't really import much grain and other essentials. This is also this period that historians used to call the Agricultural Revolution. You've got writers like Arthur Young touring the counties saying Herefordshire is really unimproved and backward. It needs to improve its agricultural production. And so enclosure is passed partly to produce more food for the country during wartime. But my argument is that it's also a tool of manufacturers and railway companies and industrialists and mine owners to expand their building operations. So you see increasingly a lot of these parliamentary bills are put forward by industrialists who want to build a mine or build lots of terraced housing for their workers using the spare land that's around on the moorland outside the factory. So I think enclosure, in particular in the Napoleonic War period, was an engine of this urbanisation of Britain. Certainly the areas that are most enclosed in this period are the upland areas around industrial cities like Sheffield or Manchester. It's enables much more land to be available for people to build on or to dig up as a mine.
I just have a very small sidebar to this. So what was the old French term you used earlier?
Profits apprendre to take.
I mean, I guess that's indicative of how this system emerged from the Norman conquest.
Yeah.
Like it feels interesting to me that the system emerged and was dismantled in response to French influence. And I guess it goes to show the significance of England's political life on farming life and agriculture.
But there's something else running through that as well, which is all about extraction, isn't it? You've got this sense that you can extract from the natural environment. And then you've got this sense that through a market capitalist kind of model, you're talking about mine owners and other kinds of use of the land. You're improving and elaborating on that capacity to extract the very maximum you can from any given tract of land. So it's kind of no surprise that market capitalism and the East India Trading Company emerge in parallel with some of those earlier enclosures.
Yeah.
This sort of limiting of access to land or this increasing sort of control of land happens in parallel with the emergence of modern business, essentially. And then we get that really consolidated in that 19th century period as we're sort of raging through the sort of industrial revolution, and everyone's sort of doubling down on their capacity to extract and extract and extract. But there is resistance to this, isn't there? And I think that's the contested bit that we haven't quite got to with your book. I mean, obviously, there's the contested nature of the term commons itself, but there are the people who are pushing back against some of these movements and shifts. And there was a really nice example in the book, and I wonder whether you could touch on that, about the goose. The goose comes back as a significant figure in this story.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually. It's all very grassroots, local resistance. So there isn't a national movement against enclosure. It is very local based, and I see that as really important, as defending your place. The goose verse, as I call it, you see this pop up throughout the 19th century and well into contemporary debates around the commons, and there's various versions of it. I mean, the one I've got in front of me is: the law looks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. So it's this idea that, okay, the people who are trying to get by subsistence, perhaps doing a bit of poaching here or, nicking a goose from the common, they're the ones who get punished. But the actual big lords of the manor or the landlords who are creating this economic system, they're not getting punished. They're actually winning from this system. And you see that verse in various forms emerge in various protests all the way through this period against the taking away of common rights and also the enclosure of land. So in the book, I start with an example from 2012, where in Lancaster there was a campaign to keep a piece of land called Freeman's Wood open for use for the public. It was going to get developed on. And as part of the campaign, they stuck up a placard with this 19th century verse on it. The first recorded example we've got of it is from, again, the Napoleonic War period, around 1814. It's printed in the papers as being an example in Essex, in Epping Forest, which again is a highly contested area because it's just on the edge of the expansion of London. It's an ex-royal hunting ground, but people use it very much for leisure. And there was an attempt to enclose Epping Forest in 1814, and that's where that verse seems to first appear, although I suspect it has longer roots than that. And you see it pop up all the way through the 19th century. Liberal land reformers, free trade liberals use it whenever there's a by-election against someone who's, it pops up in Nazing Common, 1836, the by-election there. It's used against the Tory candidate who's alleged to have built a house on the common and sort of encroached on it. So it pops up again and again, and I quite like the idea that it's a running theme. It's almost a meme. It's instead of our pigs, we now got geese as our meme.
And I love the fact that it's about geese, and there aren't that many geese in our lives, in our day-to-day lives. This harks back to the conversation we had with Dolly Jurgensen about the pigs. Pigs were once ubiquitous in our lives, our day-to-day lives. Geese presumably were much more common. If we had those commoners' rights, there was a time when Joe and I might have had the right to keep 4 or 5 geese on a particular tract of land. Well,
in this room in the museum.
Yeah, we have no geese in the room with us, sadly. No. But, there you go.
Katrina, are you also aware of the game Untitled Goose Game?
I am indeed. I think the goose would represent a lot in terms of popular resistance to restrictions on people's where they can go.
Yeah, it rings a bell. Explain to me what happens in.
It's a game where I think that the opening screen says something like, "It's a lovely day in the neighborhood, and you are a horrible goose." Where basically you just have to torment a small rural community as a goose by doing things like steal the old man's hat, or hide his phone, or throw the radio in the puddle.
So the goose is a metaphor for resistance.
Yeah,
fighting back,
revenge.
Pushback. Yeah, protest. I like it. I wonder whether this speaks also to something to do with that question of rural and urban. I was struck in the book the degree to which these aren't really that meaningful, these categories of sort of dividing off the rural and the urban. There's a huge amount of stuff that happens protesting the rights that we have that happens in urban centres, but it also happens in rural spaces. I think there's that sense that round about the same period you're talking about, mid-19th century, is that tipping point where suddenly we're all more of us in towns and cities. So there's a tendency, I think, for us to elaborate on that myth and to think that somehow commons and arguments about commons are to do with green spaces. Is there something in that?
Yeah, so this is also the period when the myth of the commons shifts. So I think most people knew that in the 18th century, commons are to do with common rights and that you have the right to graze 3 geese on your nearest common. But with urbanisation, particularly the growth of London, but also the other big cities, you get this peri-urban, peri-rural hinterland around the cities and around the big towns, where people are living both rural and urban lives. And as the residential areas and manufacturing areas expand, that increasingly restricts people's access to the countryside, or at least access to green space, the more polluted that industrial cities become. So we see this shift of the myth of the commons becomes more powerful. And from the 1830s onwards, manufacturers and the great and the good of all these local authorities are starting to worry about the health of the nation. They're worried about pollution, illness, cholera, epidemics. And they start thinking, actually, green space is about recreation, fresh air, they're called green lungs. That actually the commons should be about going out for a walk and being healthy, and less about commons being used for agricultural subsistence, even though that still happens to a great extent. So we see a shift. In 1833, Parliament has a select committee on public walks, which is more interesting than you might think if you actually read the report.
This is a complete tangent, but what was it called in Monty Python? Was it the Ministry of Silly Walks?
Yeah.
That
was it.
Yeah. And the report just has all the new MPs for all these new industrial boroughs. They've only just got representation under the Great Reform Act. So you've got these MPs from Manchester, Bolton, Bradford, and they're all saying, look, all my employees in my big mill or my mine don't have anywhere to go at weekends to stretch their legs. They're all dying of cholera because there's no fresh air. They don't quite understand how cholera works at this period. And so there's increasing concern about the lack of access to the countryside. And then you see this shift towards seeing the countryside as something beautiful, something to be preserved, something natural, rather than what it really had been before, which was this is an agricultural resource to be exploited or used. And that really ramps up until the 1860s when you see the formation of the preservation societies. So the Commons Preservation Society is founded in 1865, later becomes the Open Spaces Society. You have lots of footpath preservation societies that are mainly middle-class people suing local landowners for stopping footpaths up, putting barriers in front of the footpaths. And these all start to come together and coalesce in the 1860s for what we now know as the Right to Roam movement, but it wasn't really right to roam, it was just access to commons. And some of these are quite genteel middle-class societies, so we see the great and the good being part of a committee, because the great and the good love being on a committee. It's what you do if you're middle class or upper class. You want to be the deputy secretary of the subcommittee of something. But you also see working class people starting to really defend their local area from developments.
Speaking of committees, we were speaking just before the call about Handforth Parish Council, which was the iconic local council during COVID that went viral on the internet for a particularly unhinged meeting.
Feels a bit like our podcast sometimes, Joe.
Yeah, exactly. When you say that the mill owners were concerned about their workers lacking fresh air, are they the same class of mill owners who would have been, enclosing and getting this space themselves? So is there a kind of dark irony there?
Yeah, absolutely. These are the same people. I mean, they're creating the conditions that these workers are working and living in. And they are the people who are benefiting from enclosure, so they can build more of these hovels and terraced housing that doesn't have any sanitation. Yeah, it's a bit. There's a lot of ironies and contradictions in the way in which certainly Victorians start thinking about what the countryside is and what public health is.
I think there's something interesting in that relationship as well, isn't there? That this is all about hierarchy. I think we fool ourselves into thinking that in the past perhaps people had much flatter hierarchies, like we sort of do now. I mean, not always. But there was a really nice snippet of a John Clare poem that you cite in the book, The Moors, from 1820. And John Clare is a poet from a working class background, often cited in relation to things that are about pastoral England of the 19th century. And the line is, "Enclosure came and trampled on the grave of labour's rights and left the poor a slave." It's that sense that the poor are just at the bottom of this stomping ground of rights, and they're down there with the geese, with the sheep, with all of the livestock.
Well, when we chatted with Dolly Jorgensen on our episode about pigs, or our 2 episodes about pigs, Dolly mentioned that in medieval England, pigs and prostitutes were given the same legal rights. And it is interesting, this comparison between the downtrodden, impoverished worker and the animals that they're competing with for access to the commons. It does feel like there's almost like I don't know what the word is, subhumanization. The treatment feels very similar between humans and animals, I guess, just as tools or livestock or fodder, I suppose.
Yeah, but humans, as we know, are absolute units.
Yeah, it's quite,
you know. This brings us, I guess, back to parks. So these urban spaces being argued for, essentially that's the parks, is that right? Or the village green that you mentioned earlier? Are these the kinds of spaces that are being conceived of in this period as spaces for the working poor to get access to fresh air and a bit of space?
Yeah, so one of the other clauses in that 1845 General Enclosure Act does ensure that whoever's doing the enclosing, be it the Lord of the Manor or the parish or whatever authority, has to allow some space for what's called air and recreation. That's the Victorian term for leisure. So I think it's important that they mention air. Fresh air is really important, increasingly in polluted places. And I think enclosure creates a kind of sense of delineation of spaces. That if you look at enclosure on a moorland, the stone walls or the hedges cut up the space in very sort of regular ways. Similarly, I think there's new types of public space that are created in this period for air and recreation. The main one in this period in the 1840s is the public park, which is a kind of new invention. We had royal parks in London and some other areas before, but we don't have the classic Victorian park that still exists today with a promenading route around the bandstand and the nicely planted flower beds. But that goes hand in hand with the Victorian idea of rational recreation, that when you're not at work, you're doing something educational or religious or good for you, character building. So when you go to a park, you're supposed to appreciate the flowers and learn something by going in the greenhouse, looking at the botany, that kind of thing. Or you're listening to improving music and the bandstand. So these new types of spaces, I argue, are actually much more restrictive, even though they're open air, than a common would have been, because you could do anything on a common, really. There was all sorts of activities going on a common. You could have a fair, or you could have gambling, you could have prostitution, you could have all sorts of things that the Victorians are trying to clamp down on. And so that's why parks still today have long lists of bylaws posted at their entrances, and you lock them up at night as well. So they're surrounded by gates and fences. And
their space is defined by what you can't do rather than what you can, I suppose.
Exactly. And you've got a park warden telling you what to do and what not to do as well, which you wouldn't have on a common.
And if you'd like to know more about how people use the countryside today and the significance of that, go check out our episodes with Scott, who goes by Man in the Woods on Instagram.
The delineation of these new types of public spaces, which I don't want to say they're kind of controlling, because people still break the rules, obviously. But that's their intention from the paternalistic city fathers who give their land for these sites.
How does some of this compare with waste? So we talked a lot about parkland, we talked a lot about commons. There are these marginal lands and spaces that you talked a little bit about earlier. I wonder whether you might expand on those a little bit. Who's using waste and verges and margins and those kind of spaces? What's the category of people who are using them, and what are they using them for?
There's two stories here. One is the verges, which are a different type of category, but we're thinking about roadside verges. Obviously, the roads develop quite a lot in this period as transport improves. But there are lots of marginal people like gypsy, Roman traveller communities, homeless people, squatters, all these kind of people who are outside the system, really. And they're increasingly excluded in this period. And Victorian local authorities become very concerned about gypsy encampments on roadsides and on commons. and try and exclude them. There's various attempts to pass legislation against camping on commons and camping on this area. There's some wonderful lantern slides in the Open Spaces Society collection at Merle, which show Gypsy community, Roma communities camping on various commons across the country. And I think they were used by Lawrence Chubb, who was head of the Commons Preservation Society, in his lectures. And he'd go round and show these, amongst other, early photography of the countryside. And I think he'd use them to show that these people don't quite fit the beautiful idea of what the countryside should be, because of them. The countryside is supposed to be the nice, comfortable landscape of the Haywain and things like that. It's not meant to be these marginal people who are not quite as tidy. And again, this is all a myth. It's not real, but certainly there's the development of this idea of the rural idyll in this period. You see in landscape painting, in poetry, apart from John Clare, we've mentioned kind of punctures that idea.
Could we talk more about the invention of the rural idyll? Did that emerge around this time as well then, the idea of a kind of beautiful romantic countryside? And I suppose romantic poets weren't that far from this time as well.
Yeah. So that goes back to the point about waste, and another word for waste is wilderness. From the 1820s, well, a bit earlier, the Romantic writers are writing about the Lake District, starting to think about it as a special landscape. Even the Brontes talking about Southern Pennines as this kind of wilderness. There's a current debate on at the moment, we're in mid-July, about wind turbines being put in Bronte country. And again, it's that same sort of thing about what is beautiful and what's not beautiful in the countryside, and particularly on places that are moorland. And so there's those sorts of landscapes are starting to be described in terms of sublime or beautiful. And there's a certain valorisation of landscapes over others. And that's where our Commons Preservation Society people come back in, trying to sort of create this idea that the countryside is beautiful and needs to be protected because it has a natural beauty. Now, quite often that natural beauty is the southern downlands of Surrey and Sussex, rolling hills and quaint villages, that kind of thing. So again, in the Open Spaces Society lantern slides, you see that a lot of the images are of that typical English countryside. Your beautiful villages with your hay harvest being taken in, rather than perhaps the more gritty urban Pennines that I'm more familiar with, growing up in the Southern Pennines. But the Lake District, again, is reified as something beautiful, even though the Lake District itself is full of industry and mining and urban endeavours.
If you'd like to hear more about farming in the Lake District today, listen to our episodes with Amy Bateman, who we spoke to about her book, 40 Farms.
This idea of the beautiful really gets pushed through by the Commons Preservation Society, by these groups campaigning about footpaths being closed. The idea of going for a hike for leisure really emerges at this point as well. Really developed by the turn of the 20th century with the invention of the bicycle and the idea that you can go cycling for leisure. And by the time you get to the 1930s, you can go for your charabanc for a nice day out on your New York holiday. This is the shift from seeing the commons as something quite specific to do with agriculture and local rights to the idea of a national landscapes of beautiful things that need to be protected. So the same people who formed the Commons Preservation Societies in the 1860s end up forming the National Trust in the 1890s. And they realised that really to protect these landscapes, you have to buy the land or have it donated to you. We're still in this exchange economy where in order to protect things, you just need to be a property owner. So the National Trust is founded in the mid-1890s to save these landscapes that are now deemed nationally important.
So there's a nice example, harking back to what you were saying about wilderness, right here in Reading, up on the university's main White Knights campus, which was a big country estate. It's a designed landscape, and in the corner of that designed landscape is a purposefully built wilderness with fake follies in it, and it's a bit of woodland that now local residents can come and walk in because the campus is open to local community. But it was, of course, a private wilderness, a wilderness purposefully designed to look wild, but actually be quite well managed and quite well tended. It sort of plays with exactly that kind of relationship with green space that you're talking about, that we want our rural spaces, our green spaces to be accessible, but we want them to be accessible in ways that are tidy and that are well managed and accessible to the right people and not to the wrong people. And in light of that sense of those photos you mentioned that are in the Open Spaces Society collections of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities in particular points, I assume these are stopping points. These are places where traditionally over long periods of time, those same communities would have stopped as they're moving around the countryside. And as you restrict those access points to stop there, it then tips over into people needing to stop in other places because the places they're used to stopping aren't available to them anymore. So all of these things have knock-on effects, don't they?
Yeah, that's certainly the case, that as Britain urbanises quite rapidly, these traditional stopping places become inaccessible. There's more conflict with urban dwellers who've made it big in the city and then go out and live in the suburbs, and suburbanisation really affects access to these sorts of sites. So that's why these communities have to camp on the verges, because they can't get on a common because that's been built on.
I think we're probably coming to a point where we might want to wind this episode up, but maybe we'll just finish with a brief description of, you mentioned the Open Spaces Society, you mentioned some of the origins of the organisations that came from back in the mid-19th century. We obviously hold some of the archives of the Open Spaces Society here in the collections at the museum, and you held an Open Spaces Society fellowship some years ago, and I think some of that work has fed into this book, so that's amazing, and it's really nice to have you back to be talking about it. I was reminded of when you were looking at sort of lantern slides and trying to identify where they came from in the country. There were some that didn't have places associated with them. There was a really nice piece of crowdsourcing, reaching out to other people to help sort of pinpoint that shared history. And in some of those lantern slides, and I can't remember where they were of, there were sort of fairly well-to-do looking individuals who looked like they were out going for a nice walk in a nice green space. Is that the kind of relationship that you're talking about in this Victorian period, this later Victorian period? People are beginning to use these spaces for a different kind of promenading. They might be middle class rather than upper class. There are different kind of people using that. And how does that contrast with the working class? Because I don't remember there being staggering numbers of photos from that period, but maybe I'm wrong, that depicted working class communities, except perhaps those gypsy communities that you mentioned.
Yeah, so there were several hundred lantern slides, and as part of the fellowship, I tried to identify what the location of them, because quite often they didn't have a location on them. So some were quite obvious landmarks, but a lot of them were pictures of fields and a footpath through a field, and you're trying to work that out. And the individuals who appeared in these lantern slides generally did tend to be quite well dressed. There weren't that many individuals. I think the Open Spaces Society, as it became, was much more interested in, here's this beautiful landscape that we need to preserve, or we've just stopped the landowner from stopping the footpath in this area. So most of the lantern slides are of landscape rather than individuals, but certainly it's reflecting this idea that the middle classes go out for a walk, appreciate the countryside as something beautiful, and it's not necessarily a place that you associate with work, which is much more working class farming communities are obviously using these lands as their dwelling because they're in their subsistence, their livelihood. So there is a difference there that I think wasn't quite appreciated by the Commons Preservation Society at the time. The interesting thing about the crowdsourcing element of it was that I undertook the project during the main lockdowns, so I was restricted. Luckily, because the Commons Preservation Society was Surrey-based and I live in South London, I could just about get to a lot of places on the North Downs and in the Surrey Hills that these were taken from. Most notably, there was one path at Whiteleaf, which borders onto a nudist colony, still does, that I took a picture of. But others I had to request crowdsource. It was back in the days when social media was still useful for this kind of thing.
I remember seeing it on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because I think we worked together on making the map as well of the slides.
Yeah.
And
later.
there's an online exhibition on the museum's website that shows the location of some of those slides, and actually I think has that very photo in it, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
So thanks to everyone who responded on, if you're listening to this and you gave me a location of that particular field, then I'm very grateful.
Ollie, would you give a very quick description of what lantern slides are?
So for those who don't know, lantern slides are like glass plate negatives. So they're like when photographic negatives were taken onto glass, but actually these are positives, and they're used in showing slide series. So basically PowerPoints of their day, you would show them in slideshows. So for those of you who remember overhead projectors, they're a little bit like the transparencies that you might have projected on an overhead projector. And those of you who remember slideshows of the 60s and 70s, then, they're more like those, but a little bit larger in format. I guess they're maybe, I don't know, Katrina, maybe about 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, something like that. And often they have a little label on them, little handwritten label describing what the contents of the image is. But obviously in some cases that wasn't the case, and you had to go digging further afield into naturist colonies and where people might have been keeping their geese, I guess. I don't know.
Mm. Is that the etymology of slideshow?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when you put your slides together, do you?
It's a show. I think that's a really good place to draw this episode to a close. So we'll be back next time with Katrina talking more about how people respond to the commons closer to the present day. We're going to talk about raves. We're going to talk about hunt saboteurs and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and more. So thanks so much for joining us, Katrina, and we'll look forward to speaking to you next time.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.